If that janitor is your dream man, Claire, why don't you marry him tonight? The question exploded across the ballroom in a wave of laughter, drawing every eye toward the man standing quietly beside the service elevator. No one expected the young CEO's answer. And absolutely no one expected what she would discover about him weeks later. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore Financial Tower shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most families earned in a year. Silver trays floated through the crowd. Expensive watches flashed beneath tailored sleeves. The city skyline glowed beyond 40-foot windows overlooking downtown Chicago. It was the annual Whitmore Capital Foundation Gala, a night where power dressed itself in elegance and wealth congratulated itself for being generous. At the center of it all stood Claire Whitmore. 31 years old. Brilliant. Beautiful. The youngest CEO in company history. Her navy evening gown reflected the soft gold light as investors, executives, and reporters surrounded her with smiles that always seemed slightly rehearsed. "Claire, be honest," one board member said, raising a glass. "With all the men chasing you, what exactly is your type?" The group laughed. Someone else joined in. "Yeah, tell us. Wall Street billionaire? Tech genius? Senator?" Claire rolled her eyes playfully. "None of those sound very relaxing." More laughter followed. Then another executive pointed toward the far side of the ballroom. "What about him?" Heads turned. Near the service corridor, a man in a gray maintenance uniform adjusted a ladder beside an elevator control panel. He looked completely out of place among the tuxedos and designer dresses. Graham Walker. 41 years old. Quiet. Unremarkable at first glance. The kind of man most people noticed only when something stopped working. Claire followed their gaze. The corners of her mouth lifted. "Honestly," she said. "He might be the safest option in the room." The crowd burst into laughter. "That's your dream match," someone teased. Claire shrugged. "At least he looks honest." More laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Even a few photographers smiled. Across the room, Graham heard every word. He paused for exactly 1 second. Then he returned to tightening a panel screw. No anger. No embarrassment. No attempt to defend himself. Just calm silence. That silence carried something unusual. Something that didn't belong in a room built on status. Claire glanced toward him again. Most people would have looked uncomfortable after becoming the punchline of a wealthy crowd. Graham simply continued working as if none of it mattered. For a brief moment, she found that strangely unsettling. Then the evening moved on. Speeches resumed. Glasses clinked. Conversations drifted toward investments and acquisitions. Outside, snow began falling over the city. Inside, the tower hummed with confidence. Yet beneath the polished marble floors and beneath the billion-dollar deals being celebrated that night, secrets slept quietly. And the man everyone had just laughed at happened to know where those secrets were buried. If this story has you hooked, take a second to subscribe. It really helps the channel. Also, are you Team CEO or Team Single Dad? Let me know in the comments. Now, back to the story. Graham Walker lived 18 miles from the glittering towers of downtown Chicago, in a modest brick apartment building where nobody cared about stock prices, executive titles, or luxury galas. By 6 o'clock the next morning, the memory of the laughter had already faded into the background noise of another ordinary day. The smell of coffee drifted through the small kitchen while winter sunlight filtered through worn curtains. Graham stood at the stove flipping pancakes as his 9-year-old daughter sat at the table finishing homework she had insisted on completing before school. "Dad, you burned this one." Sophie pointed with a grin. "That is called extra flavor," Graham replied. "That is called charcoal. You are becoming difficult to impress." Sophie laughed, and for a moment the apartment felt warmer than the expensive ballroom ever had. The room was simple. A second-hand couch sat against one wall. Family photos filled a narrow shelf. Most showed Sophie smiling beside her father at parks, county fairs, and school events. There were no signs of wealth. No expensive artwork. No luxury furniture. Just a life built carefully, one paycheck at a time. After breakfast, Graham drove Sophie to school in an aging pickup truck that rattled slightly every time it stopped at a traffic light. As she climbed out, she leaned back through the passenger window. "Do not work too hard today." "I will try." "You always say that. And you always remind me." Sophie smiled and disappeared through the school entrance. Graham waited until she was safely inside before driving toward Financial Tower. The city skyline rose ahead like steel mountains against the pale winter sky. By 7:30, he was back in his maintenance uniform, pushing a cart through corridors lined with polished marble and glass. Employees hurried past carrying laptops and coffee cups. Most barely noticed him. Graham preferred it that way. There was peace in being overlooked. There was freedom in silence. Around lunchtime, he sat alone in a small maintenance room tucked behind the mechanical floors. The room contained little more than a folding chair, a metal desk, and rows of equipment manuals. At first glance, it seemed completely ordinary. But hidden behind a locked cabinet stood a heavy steel safe. Graham waited until the hallway outside was quiet before entering a combination. The door opened with a soft click. Inside were dozens of black notebooks arranged in perfect order. Not diaries. Not journals. Financial models. Market forecasts. Risk calculations. Entire systems written by hand in precise detail. Thousands of pages. Years of work. Graham removed one notebook and opened it. Complex formulas filled every page. Flowcharts connected institutions, investment structures, and security layers. The information looked less like notes and more like blueprints. His eyes moved calmly across the pages before he closed the book again. A faint smile crossed his face. Then his phone vibrated. A text message from Sophie appeared. "Got an A on my science test." Graham's smile widened immediately. "Proud of you. Ice cream tonight." A few seconds later came her reply. "Best dad ever." Graham placed the phone back into his pocket and locked the safe. The notebooks disappeared once again. Behind steel and silence. Outside the maintenance room, executives continued making billion-dollar decisions. Inside that hidden corner of the tower, something far more valuable remained unseen. And not a single person in the building suspected that the quiet maintenance worker knew more about the financial empire surrounding them than the people running it. 3 days later, a single blinking warning light threatened to turn the confidence of Whitmore Capital into panic. It began just after 10:15 on a Wednesday morning. Traders stopped talking. Analysts stopped typing. Phones started ringing faster than anyone could answer them. Across multiple floors of Financial Tower, transaction systems began freezing without explanation. Numbers stalled. Transfers hung in limbo. Entire portfolios suddenly appeared inaccessible. Within minutes, tension spread through the building like a storm cloud rolling across open farmland. "Why are the settlement reports delayed?" one manager demanded. "The servers are responding, but the data is not moving," an analyst answered. "Try restarting the processing queue." "We already did." "Then do it again." The exchanges grew sharper. The pressure grew heavier. By 11 o'clock, executives were gathering in an emergency conference room on the 38th floor. Claire Whitmore sat at the head of the table, listening as department heads delivered increasingly frustrating updates. Large screens displayed system diagrams covered in yellow warning indicators. The room felt warmer than it should have. Coffee cups sat untouched. Nobody smiled. Trevor Kane stood near the presentation screen, adjusting his tie. The technical team is working on it, he said. We should have answers soon. Claire folded her arms. That is what they said 45 minutes ago. Nobody replied. The silence carried its own message. Nobody had answers. Meanwhile, 2 floors below, Graham pushed his maintenance cart down a quiet corridor. He heard fragments of anxious conversations as employees hurried past him. Most barely noticed him. One young analyst nearly collided with the cart. Sorry. You are fine, Graham said calmly. The analyst rushed away. Graham continued walking until he passed an open operations room. Inside, several engineers stared at a wall of monitors. One of them rubbed his forehead. Another muttered something under his breath. The atmosphere felt less like a workplace and more like a hospital waiting room. Graham slowed briefly. His eyes drifted toward one screen. Then another. Then a third. The data flashed past in organized streams. Error codes. Traffic reports. Routing patterns. For a moment, his expression changed. Not alarm. Recognition. One engineer noticed him standing there. Can I help you? Graham pointed gently toward a monitor. Have you checked node 47? The engineer blinked. What? Node 47, Graham repeated. Look at the synchronization delay. A second engineer frowned. The delay is showing up everywhere. Graham nodded. Because everything routes through 47. The room fell quiet. One engineer turned back toward the screen. Fingers moved rapidly across a keyboard. Seconds passed. Then 20. Then 30. Suddenly a yellow warning indicator disappeared. Another followed. Then another. Wait, someone whispered. More commands were entered. The frozen queues began moving. Transactions restarted. Reports refreshed. The room erupted with stunned reactions. That is impossible. How did we miss that? The bottleneck was hidden behind a mirror process. Who found it? Several heads turned toward the doorway. But Graham was already walking away with his maintenance cart. Calm. Silent. Uninterested in credit. By noon, most systems had returned to normal. Relief swept through the tower. Employees resumed work. Executives relaxed. The crisis seemed over. Yet on the 38th floor, Claire stared at the recovery report with growing curiosity. One line caught her attention. Initial routing issue identified through manual observation. She looked up. Who made the observation? Nobody seemed certain. And somewhere deep inside Financial Tower, a man who supposedly fixed elevators had just solved a problem that millions of dollars worth of experts had failed to see. Claire Whitmore had spent her entire career learning one simple rule. When something did not make sense, pay attention to it. By Thursday morning, the maintenance worker who somehow identified a hidden system bottleneck had become the only thing in Financial Tower that did not make sense. The recovery meeting had ended. The crisis had passed. Most executives had already moved on to earnings projections and investment forecasts. Claire had not. She sat alone in her office overlooking Lake Michigan, a tablet resting on her desk as she reviewed the incident report for the third time. The same question kept returning. How had a maintenance employee spotted a problem that experienced engineers had missed? She pressed a button on her desk phone. Megan, can you come in for a moment? Her executive assistant entered carrying a folder. You needed something. Claire slid the report forward. I want information on Graham Walker. Megan looked surprised. The maintenance guy? Yes. What kind of information? Everything. 20 minutes later, a digital employee profile appeared on Claire's screen. She expected the answer to be simple. Maybe he had worked in information technology years ago. Maybe he had taken a few engineering courses. Maybe there was some reasonable explanation. Instead, the file raised more questions than it answered. Name: Graham Walker. Age: 41. Employment status: building maintenance. Emergency contact: Sophie Walker. Education field: empty. Prior employment history: minimal. Professional certifications: none listed. Claire frowned. That cannot be right. She opened additional records. The same result appeared. There were gaps everywhere. Entire sections contained almost nothing. It was as if someone had deliberately erased pieces of his past. Megan leaned over her shoulder. That is strange. Very. Claire clicked through older databases. Tax records. Public directories. Archived employment information. Most people left a digital trail stretching back years. Graham's trail seemed to vanish roughly a decade earlier. People do not simply disappear from records, Claire said quietly. Megan crossed her arms. Maybe he likes privacy. Privacy is one thing. This is something else. Outside the office windows, snow drifted slowly between the skyscrapers. The city moved beneath gray winter clouds while Claire continued digging deeper. Hours later she found herself looking through archived company records. Maintenance requests. Security clearances. Internal authorizations. Then she noticed something unusual. Graham possessed access permissions that appeared older than his employment date. She blinked and checked again. The permissions were real. Some had been issued years before he officially joined the maintenance department. That cannot be right either, she whispered. Meanwhile, several floors below, Graham replaced a damaged light fixture in a quiet hallway. His movements remained calm and deliberate. He seemed completely unaware that the CEO herself was investigating him. Or perhaps he knew and simply did not care. At lunchtime, Claire left her office and walked through the building personally. Employees greeted her as she passed. She acknowledged them politely but kept searching. Eventually she spotted Graham near a service elevator. He was reviewing a maintenance checklist while sunlight streamed through nearby windows. For a moment she simply watched. There was nothing remarkable about him. No arrogance. No attempt to impress anyone. No hunger for attention. Yet somehow that made him more difficult to understand. "Mr. Walker?" she asked. Graham looked up. "Good afternoon, Ms. Whitmore. I heard you helped during yesterday's system issue. I only made an observation. A very useful one." Graham nodded politely. "I am glad it helped." Then he returned to his checklist. No pride. No explanation. No curiosity about why the CEO had approached him personally. Claire stood there a second longer than necessary. Something about the exchange felt incomplete. As if she had opened a book and discovered half the pages missing. And as Graham walked away down the corridor, she became more certain of one thing. The quiet man everyone overlooked was hiding a story much larger than anyone in Financial Tower realized. The deeper Claire Whitmore looked, the less Graham Walker resembled the man everyone believed him to be. By the following Tuesday, curiosity had quietly evolved into determination. She told herself it was about security. A responsible chief executive should understand anyone connected to sensitive areas of the building. Yet deep down, she knew the truth was more personal than that. Graham had become a puzzle, and Claire had never been good at walking away from unanswered questions. The opportunity arrived unexpectedly just after 6:30 in the evening. Most employees had gone home. The trading floors were quiet. Hallways that normally buzzed with conversation now echoed only with distant ventilation systems and the occasional hum of elevators. Claire was leaving a late meeting when she spotted Graham entering a restricted service corridor near the eastern wing of the tower. She slowed her pace. That hallway led nowhere important. At least, that was what most employees believed. Graham carried a small maintenance case and disappeared through a gray security door. Something about the moment felt unusual. Claire hesitated only briefly before following at a distance. The corridor beyond was narrow and dimly lit. Old sections of the building still remained hidden behind layers of modernization, forgotten by most people who worked there. Graham walked calmly toward a reinforced access point at the end of the hallway. Claire stopped behind a corner where she could observe without being seen. The door ahead required multiple security levels. Very few people even knew it existed. Graham placed his maintenance case on the floor. Then he approached the access panel. Claire expected him to enter a code. Instead, he placed his hand against a biometric scanner. A soft green light appeared immediately. Her eyes narrowed. The scanner accepted him without hesitation. Then something happened that made her heart skip. A voice emerged from the aging speaker system. Identity confirmed. Graham remained motionless. The next words echoed through the quiet corridor. "Welcome back, architect." Claire froze. For a moment she wondered if she had misheard. Architect? The heavy door unlocked with a metallic click. Graham collected his case and stepped inside. The door closed behind him. Silence returned. Claire stood completely still. The title made no sense. Financial Tower employed engineers, analysts, executives, and consultants. Nobody carried a designation called architect. At least nobody currently working there. Her pulse quickened as questions flooded her mind. What architect? Architect of what? Why did an old security system recognize a maintenance worker with a title that no longer appeared anywhere in company records? 20 minutes later, Graham emerged from the secured area and continued toward the elevators as calmly as if nothing unusual had occurred. He never noticed Claire hidden farther down the hallway. Or perhaps he did and simply chose not to acknowledge it. That possibility somehow felt even more unsettling. Later that night, Claire sat alone in her office long after sunset. The city lights glittered across the dark water beyond her windows. She searched internal archives. Historical access records. Retired organizational charts. Legacy infrastructure documents. Most produced nothing. Then, buried inside a 20-year-old database, she discovered a single reference. Project Architect. Status classified. Identity restricted. Access level unavailable. Claire stared at the screen. There was no photograph. No name. No explanation. Just 2 words. Project Architect. Outside, snow drifted slowly through the Chicago night. Inside the tower, a secret older than Claire's entire career had begun to stir. And for the first time, she suspected that Graham Walker was not simply connected to that secret. He might be standing at the very center of it. The following week, Claire stopped looking for answers in the present and began searching the past. Financial Tower had existed for nearly 3 decades, surviving recessions, market crashes, mergers, and leadership changes that had destroyed competing firms. Somewhere inside that history, she believed the truth about Graham Walker was waiting. Late one evening, after most employees had gone home, she descended into the company's archival records department buried beneath the main building. The room smelled faintly of paper, dust, and old electronics. Rows of storage cabinets stretched beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed softly overhead. A gray-haired archivist named Harold looked up from his desk when she entered. "Ms. Whitmore. Working late?" Claire smiled politely. "I need information about a project from around 15 years ago." Harold adjusted his glasses. "That was before your time." "I know. What project?" Claire hesitated. Project architect. The archivist's expression changed immediately. Not fear. Recognition. I have not heard that name in years. Claire leaned forward. You know what it was? Harold remained silent for several seconds before standing. He disappeared between two aisles and returned carrying a worn archive box. Dust floated through the air as he placed it on a table. Most of this was sealed, he said quietly. But some documents were cleared years ago. Claire opened the box. Inside were reports, meeting summaries, and newspaper clippings from a period she barely knew existed. 15 years earlier, Whitmore Capital had faced a catastrophe. Multiple financial systems had nearly collapsed at once. Settlement failures threatened billions of dollars in assets. Regulators had begun asking questions. Investors were preparing to flee. According to the records, the company had been only weeks away from disaster. Yet somehow everything changed. A revolutionary architecture had been designed and implemented in record time. The new framework stabilized operations, restored confidence, and eventually transformed Financial Tower into one of the most respected financial institutions in America. Claire turned page after page. The same title appeared repeatedly. Architect. Architect Review. Architect Design Approval. Architect Emergency Authority. Yet no actual name appeared anywhere. Who was this person? She asked. Harold shook his head. Nobody ever knew. That cannot be true. It is. He folded his arms. All anyone knew was that a young financial systems genius appeared when the company needed one. He solved problems nobody else could solve. Then he disappeared. Claire stared at an old photograph attached to one report. A conference room filled with executives. One chair near the center had been deliberately blurred before archiving. Why would someone erase him? Harold looked away. Maybe because somebody wanted the credit. The words lingered in the quiet room. Claire continued reading. Several names appeared repeatedly throughout the documents. Former executives. Board members. Consultants. Then one name caught her attention. Trevor Kane. 15 years younger but already involved in strategic planning meetings connected to the project. Claire's heartbeat quickened. Trevor was one of the few senior leaders still with the company. One of the few people who might know the entire story. As she closed the final folder, another realization settled over her. If the mysterious architect truly built the foundation that saved Financial Tower, then someone had spent 15 years making sure his identity remained hidden. And for reasons Claire could not yet explain, every path she followed seemed to lead back to the same quiet maintenance worker who never asked for recognition, never defended himself, and never seemed surprised by anything happening around him. By the end of the month, Financial Tower appeared calm on the surface, but beneath the polished glass and confident earnings reports, something dangerous was unfolding. Claire could feel it. Numbers that should have aligned were drifting apart. Internal forecasts looked unusually optimistic. Certain investment reports seemed polished almost too perfectly. The more she reviewed them, the more uneasy she became. One rainy Thursday afternoon, she called an executive review meeting. Senior managers filled the conference room. Screens displayed performance charts. Trevor Kane stood near the front with his usual confidence, presenting quarterly projections that painted an impressive picture of growth. Our exposure remains fully controlled, Trevor said smoothly. Risk levels are well within acceptable thresholds. Several board members nodded. Claire studied the figures silently. Something felt wrong. Not obviously wrong. Carefully wrong. Deliberately wrong. After the meeting ended, she remained seated while the others filed out. Trevor noticed. You seem concerned. Claire looked at him. I am verifying a few things. Trevor smiled. That is why you are a good chief executive. His Answer sounded pleasant, but something behind it felt guarded. Later that evening, an alert arrived from the compliance department. Several archived transaction records had been altered. The changes were subtle. Small enough that most people would never notice them. Yet together they suggested a troubling pattern. Claire immediately ordered an internal review. The next morning, rumors began spreading through the building. Employees whispered near elevators. Conversations stopped when managers approached. Anxiety moved through departments that normally operated with quiet confidence. Then came the shock. Security officers entered the maintenance division shortly after noon. Several employees watched from their desks. Graham looked up from a work order as the officers approached. "Mr. Walker," one said politely, "we need to ask you a few questions." Nearby employees exchanged confused glances. "About what?" Graham asked calmly. "There are concerns regarding unauthorized access to restricted systems." The room became silent. Graham's expression never changed. "I understand." The officers escorted him toward an interview room. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. Yet word spread through the tower within minutes. The maintenance worker. The restricted access. The hidden records. Employees began connecting details they barely understood. Some assumed guilt. Others simply enjoyed having a mystery to discuss. Human nature often rushed toward conclusions before truth had a chance to arrive. Claire heard the news while reviewing documents in her office. She stood immediately. "Who authorized this?" she asked. "The request came through executive compliance," Megan answered. Claire's eyes narrowed. "Signed by whom?" A brief silence followed. Then Megan handed her the authorization. Trevor Kane's name appeared at the bottom. Across the building, Graham sat alone in a quiet conference room. Rain tapped softly against the windows. A cup of untouched coffee rested on the table. He seemed less concerned than the people investigating him. Almost as if he had seen something like this before. Meanwhile, Claire continued digging through archival records connected to Project Architect. Near midnight, she finally discovered a forgotten memorandum buried inside an old legal folder. The document listed contributors whose work had been reassigned during an emergency restructuring 15 years earlier. One name had been blacked out. But beneath the redaction, faint impressions remained visible. Claire stared at the page. Her pulse quickened. Then she found another signature. Trevor Kane. Suddenly the pieces began fitting together. The hidden architect. The erased identity. The missing records. The altered history. And for the first time, Claire no longer believed Graham had been hiding from the truth. She began to suspect someone else had spent 15 years hiding the truth from him. The emergency board meeting began at 9 o'clock sharp on Monday morning. Every seat around the long walnut conference table was filled. Executives sat rigidly. Legal advisors whispered quietly among themselves. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago disappeared beneath low gray clouds. The atmosphere felt heavy, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Claire Whitmore stood at the head of the room reviewing a stack of documents. Trevor Kane appeared calm, but those who knew him well noticed the tension hiding behind his confident smile. At the far end of the table sat Graham Walker. His maintenance uniform looked strangely out of place among expensive suits and executive titles. Several board members exchanged skeptical glances. One leaned toward another and whispered, "Why is the maintenance man here?" Nobody answered. Claire finally looked up. "Before we begin," she said, "there are facts this board needs to hear." The room fell silent. She activated a screen. Historical records appeared. Archived project files. Old financial reports. Internal memorandums. Documents nobody had seen in years. Trevor shifted slightly in his chair. "What is this?" he asked. Claire did not look at him. The truth. She revealed the timeline she had spent days reconstructing. 15 years earlier, Financial Tower had stood on the edge of collapse. Systems were failing. Investors were leaving. Confidence had evaporated. Then an unidentified architect designed an entirely new financial framework that saved the company. The room listened carefully. Several board members nodded as memories returned. They knew the story. They had lived through it. But they had never known the identity behind it. Claire advanced to the next slide. The architect's name was removed from company history. Murmurs spread around the table. Trevor's jaw tightened. That is speculation. Claire calmly placed another document on the screen. No. This is evidence. A signed memorandum appeared. Then another. Then another. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. Several executives stared in disbelief. Trevor suddenly stood. These records are incomplete. Sit down, Trevor, Claire replied. Her voice remained calm, but the authority inside it filled the room. For the first time in years, Trevor obeyed without argument. Claire turned toward Graham. Mr. Walker, would you please show them? Every eye in the room shifted toward him. Graham remained still for a moment. Then he opened a worn leather portfolio he had carried quietly into the meeting. Inside were original blueprints. Handwritten calculations. System maps. Architectural designs. Thousands of interconnected pathways that formed the foundation of Financial Tower's entire financial infrastructure. The room became completely silent. Graham placed the documents on the table one by one. I designed the original framework, he said softly. Every major system still operating today traces back to these plans. Nobody interrupted. Nobody questioned him. They simply stared. One senior board member slowly removed his glasses. Another leaned forward as if trying to process what he was seeing. Graham continued speaking with the same quiet dignity he had shown from the beginning. No arrogance. No anger. No desire for revenge. Only facts. The project succeeded, he said. But afterward, ownership of the work changed hands. His eyes briefly met Trevor's. I chose to leave rather than fight for recognition. The silence deepened. Years of assumptions collapsed in a matter of seconds. The maintenance worker they had overlooked. The man they barely noticed. The man some had quietly mocked. He was not standing in the shadow of Financial Tower. He had built the foundation beneath it. For several seconds after Graham finished speaking, nobody in the boardroom moved. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody whispered to a colleague. The silence was complete. It was the kind of silence that only appears when truth finally arrives and leaves no room for excuses. Outside the windows, snow drifted across the Chicago skyline. Inside, years of assumptions had quietly fallen apart. One board member cleared his throat. Another looked down at the original blueprints spread across the table. The signatures matched. The dates matched. The calculations matched. The evidence was undeniable. Claire stood beside Graham and addressed the room. The internal review is complete. Her voice was calm and steady. Records were altered. Contributions were reassigned. Historical documentation was intentionally concealed. Every eye shifted toward Trevor Kane. For the first time since anyone could remember, he had no prepared answer. No polished explanation. No confident smile. Only silence. Within days, independent auditors completed their investigation. The findings confirmed everything Claire had uncovered. Decisions were made. Leadership changes followed. The company began correcting 15 years of history. Yet through it all, Graham never celebrated. He never demanded recognition. He never spoke with bitterness. When reporters requested interviews, he declined. When executives offered public ceremonies, he politely refused. Recognition had never been the reason he built anything. A week later, employees gathered in the main atrium of Financial Tower. Hundreds filled the space beneath the towering glass ceiling. Claire stepped onto a small stage. Behind her, a new display had been installed. It featured the original architectural framework that had saved the company years earlier. At the center appeared a name that had finally been restored. Graham Walker. Applause began slowly. Then it grew stronger. Soon the entire atrium was filled with people standing. Some applauded because they respected him. Others because they admired him. Many because they regretted never noticing him sooner. Graham stood quietly near the back of the crowd. The attention seemed almost uncomfortable. Claire found him afterward near the service elevators where this story had truly begun. "You should be proud," she said softly. Graham smiled. "I am. That is all. That is enough." Claire studied him for a moment. The same man everyone had overlooked was standing exactly where he had always stood. Unchanged by recognition. Unchanged by status. Unchanged by applause. The difference was that now everyone else could finally see him. That evening, Graham drove home through light snowfall. The city lights reflected across wet streets while holiday decorations glowed from apartment windows. When he opened the door, Sophie ran toward him carrying a science project. "Dad, you are late. Big day at work. Did you fix something?" Graham laughed softly. "Something like that." Later, they sat together at the kitchen table sharing ice cream exactly as promised weeks earlier. Sophie looked up from her bowl. "Dad?" "Yes." "Are we rich now?" Graham smiled. The question hung in the warm air for a moment. Then he shook his head gently. "No, sweetheart." "Then what changed?" Graham looked around the small apartment. The photographs. The laughter. The life they had built together. Then he answered. "People finally learned the truth." Sophie nodded as if that made perfect sense. A soft knock came at the door. Graham opened it and found Claire standing there holding 2 cups of coffee. Snow rested lightly on her coat. Neither of them spoke immediately. They simply smiled. Sometimes respect arrives before friendship. Sometimes friendship arrives before love. And sometimes the greatest victory is not becoming someone new. It is being seen for who you were all along. As the snow continued falling outside, the noise of the city faded into the distance, and for the first time in many years, the future felt quietly open. Thanks for spending your time with us today. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe and support the channel. And I'm curious, how old are you, and did this story feel relatable to you? Let me know in the comments. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.